Hi, my name is Greg Dudek. I'm a professor at McGill University in Montreal, and I'm going to be using this homemade video as a replacement for the originally planned keynote talk that I would have given if not for the coronavirus epidemic.
I'll be running the slide deck pretty much as normal, and I'll be appearing in a little moving box with my picture in it, so it'll give you some sense that I'm actually giving a talk to you. So I'll talk about using robotic systems to better understand the natural world in which we live. And I think we all can appreciate that today robots can work for us in many diverse kinds of environments. Under the ocean, over the land, on the surface of the water, even on other planets. Robotics can help us understand the world we live in, collect measurements, maybe even moderate our impact on the world or help us produce better crops, help us understand the way the world's biodiversity is evolving and changing over time. Some of the many potential applications of robotic systems in understanding the geosphere include things like understanding the shape and distribution of plankton blooms and the biochemical phenomena that are associated with them, or measuring and understanding oil spills and how they're moving and maybe how to interact with them, how to even ameliorate their effects, or doing terrestrial inspection, whether it's looking for resources, understanding the effects of climate change, or looking inside a power dam, or maybe doing things like animal tracking, understanding biodiversity and the ecosystem and the complex interactions that make it up, or in fact doing search and rescue in the lakes, in the ocean, in other kinds of environments. All of these are very natural ways of using robotic systems to better manage and understand and handle the planet on which we live. In fact, many of the most promising tools for understanding the planet are interlinked with machine learning and artificial intelligence. But even the most powerful machine learning tools need better data, and they need some data with which to operate. And in fact, if we want to act upon the world, the need for robotic systems become even larger. So we need to be building and deploying robots on the planet that can help us measure the world, map the world, and then perhaps interact with the natural environment to change it for our mutual benefit. And the scale of the world, the vast scale of the world, implies that simple human moderation is no longer adequate to collect the data or to do the things that need to be done. And even a single robot is not sufficient. What we almost certainly need are large teams of robots that can go out there and interact with our planet. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on building robotic explorers that can go out over our planet and interact with it. Now, these kinds of tools need to be smaller than the ones we've seen in the past, more agile, much more robust to actually be able to do a job, not just be a scientific proof of concept. We need to be able to plan and navigate in nature, to choose what we want to measure, and be fully autonomous and intelligent to get the duty cycle, the length of operation that is really needed. So in terms of the ongoing challenges, making robotic systems that are smaller and more easily deployable, that's an ongoing challenge, but it's one that we seem to have the engineering tools to surmount, and it's kind of a natural progression that we're seeing take place right now. Likewise, getting robotic systems that are more agile. We're making pretty good progress as a field, as a scientific discipline, in terms of surmounting that. The problem of planning and navigation in nature, well, we've all seen things like self-driving cars that are able to plan and move around by themselves. But it's notable that these vehicles that we see starting to drive on our roads, despite the big challenges, they're only able to do it in city-like environments and so-called cultural environments, where we have well-known sets of obstacles and challenges and roadways, and we can do plenty of mapping in advance. In the natural world, which is much more unconstrained or much less constrained, and which has much higher diversity as well as temporal change, things are not so good. Our ability to plan and navigate in truly natural environments is not fantastic right now. And in fact, there are very significant challenges to our understanding of how to build AI systems, and robotic systems can do this. Likewise, if we want to choose what we want to measure out in the world, of course, scientists can often do this, not always, but at least sometimes. But the ability of robotic systems to choose on their own what they should be measuring and where, that still remains an area of very active research. And finally, if you want full autonomy and true, well, not a simulacrum of intelligence, let us say, those also remain ongoing and very exciting challenges for our field. And that's kind of the space in which I want to talk to you right now. So the kind of questions I want to face are: where should a robot go? How does it choose where it should go in the world? And how does it cope with the highly variable natural world in which we live? How does it understand that variability and try to map that variability into some understandable context in which it can make choices? And finally, what should a robot system look at, and how does it make that choice of where to look at? And finally, How does it learn to do these things? Because we can't proscribe or code up every interesting thing in the natural world the way we might do in a factory environment because of the tremendous variability and temporal change embedded in the real world. And so learning becomes far, far more important in the unconstrained natural environment. And finally, as has been observed by many ethnologists, biologists over time, there's a profound linkage between our ability to conceptualize and understand the world and move about in it. And so an additional challenge is how we can actually execute on this knowledge. How do we take the ability to move and the ability to interact with the world and exchange data with this data collection process and the conceptualization process, if we can use that metaphor. So to give you a sense of where this presentation is going to go, I want to look at a spectrum of AI-driven data collection approaches or policies. When we think about going out in the world and doing navigation and doing data gathering, how can we make this work and how has this changed over time? So I think classical methods, like using predetermined waypoints that are selected in advance, or predetermined routes selected in advance for some homogeneous set of vehicles, or maybe for one vehicle, that's very classic. I'm not going to talk about those, but that's kind of out there today, and it really worked quite beautifully. What I want to talk about now are using data-driven autonomous route selection methods with predefined observables. So I want to measure temperature or humidity or oxygen or dissolved gases in the water or visual features. I know what it is I'm observing. I want to just drive around and take measurements, but I want to autonomously change the routing, change the destinations as a function of data that's coming. That's what I'm going to talk about next. Then I want to think about interactive waypoint and route selection, where we have a scientist in the loop who actually can help us select those places we're going to go dynamically over time. And in the work that we do, we use a team of robots, different robots, flying robots and non-flying robots that let us do this in a very rich and beautiful way, I think. Then I'll talk briefly about automated novelty seeking and discovery, where we can have robotic systems that have their own notion of what's new and exciting, and they can chase that notion of novelty to find things that we never expected them to find. And finally, I'll talk about category-based data seeking, where we can take the kind of notions of novelty, but actually add our own notion of we want this and we don't want that. And so we can have robots that go seek data on their own, but seek data for particular objectives or needs that we may have as humans or as scientists. Scientists are actually a kind of human usually. So one of the often overlooked challenges in doing all this is beautiful, right? Nice machine learning, we have lots of data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if we want to think about robotics, we have to take all these beautiful ideas and put them on the side a little bit and think about the issue of getting robots out there to do stuff. That's in some sense actually a harder problem. How do we move robustly in the world? How do we recognize and avoid hazards, including dynamic hazards, things that move, people that move, seaweed that moves, all sorts of things, even weather? How do we select suitable routes in view of navigability considerations, rough ground, fallen trees, bad terrain, things floating in the water? And then how do we recover from problems? Because in any real robotic deployment, problems happen, and we have to have dynamic recovery. So these four additional considerations, those are things that really, really make robotics tricky when you want to sort of make the rubber hit the road. It's why companies that do self-driving cars, we had the core scientific technology in the 90s, and now it's taken 20 years to get things on the road that really kind of work robustly in the robotics sense. So my talk today focuses on coral reefs. Why? Well, first of all, most of the world is ocean. And if we want to understand our world, why not focus on the thing that takes up most of what we are? In addition, the oceans of the world are the least well understood, and they're the hardest places for us to get to as humans. So there's a real need for robotics technologies in this kind of domain, and it's incredibly important in terms of ecosystem. So the story today will focus a little bit on coral reefs specifically, although with techniques that we can apply and do apply in other domains as well. Notably, if we think about the way reefs have evolved from the 70s until now and into, say, towards 2050, the reefs that were almost all alive in 1975 are currently only kind of 50-50 at best. A lot of the world's reefs are now dead or dying, and by 2050 the prediction is that most of them will be dead, or mostly dead. There's things being done to remediate, and that's exactly why we need robotic systems to help us. Not so much to fix them, but to understand them. And a classical example is this reef known as Carysfort, where we have longitudinal data from the 1970s until recently, 2014 in this picture, and you can see the evolution of that reef from healthy to a wasteland today. And so using robotic systems to measure and understand what's going on and then measure how our remediation efforts may be affecting things is a critical sample application. This key sample vehicle I want to talk about in this talk is called Aqua. It's a vehicle that uses 6 legs. It's a hexapod. It's not the only vehicle one could use. It's not the only vehicle we use, but it's a kind of pretty vehicle as an exemplar for this important application domain. And it walks and it swims. Here's an example of the Aqua vehicle walking into the water and then swimming away. In this particular case, the robot is teleoperated with a fiber optic tether, but for almost all our work, it's fully autonomous. And so the question is, where should a robot like this go, and what should it look like? And these same questions apply to swimming, flying, driving, every kind of robotic system. An example application might be fully autonomous sampling of environmental properties. For example, coral reefs, but anything else. We want to drive around, and based on data we collect, maybe we want to collect bathymetry, depth, maybe we want to collect visual data, maybe we want to use bathymetry to drive depth, but this question of where to collect samples is one of the key issues and one of the key problems. And so the generic idea is maybe we have a notion of where reefs are from aerial photos, and what we'd like to do is get down there on the ground and collect real data guided by that aerial data as a so-called prior, as a notion in advance of where data might be good. And so given some region of interest, we want to get efficient sampling to get the good things, the important things that are changing, for example, where oxygen is low, or where algae blooms are high, or where there's oil or something. And this notion of efficient sampling refers to collecting data with maximum information in minimum time, or minimum fuel, or minimum whatever it is it costs you. That is, get your good data with as little work as possible. Pretty good principle in general. And so the goal of this little part of the talk is to collect samples that maximize reward, maximize value, while minimizing the underlying cost in getting that data. And so one approach, one quite classic approach that we're using, is to use so-called Gaussian process modeling. So we start off with zero knowledge, or maybe little knowledge from a satellite photo. We do a little bit of sparse sampling, we get a little bit of data, and from that little bit of data, we build an initial model. And from that initial model, we can now use that to form a stronger prior. We can do some selective sampling from that better prior about where to get data. That in turn lets us come up with a stronger sampling path where we can go and get more data. And that additional data lets us construct a much stronger model with our Gaussian process model, a beautiful mathematical technology. That reconstruction is now much more richer and much more faithful. And then finally, we can close the loop, update our notion of where reward is and where things are going on, and iteratively improve the selective sampling model, and so end up getting more and more efficient models as our model is built over time. This generic approach can be used in a policy search framework. So policy search is a mechanism for choosing what the robot should do next. It's not quite classical reinforcement learning because of the temporal variability of the domain, but we have generic models. We use RL learning for building some probability map, a feature-based learning phase where we actually build a model that generates a policy, and the policy gives us actions for our robot to move around. The generic models are not faithful to a particular environment necessarily, they're generic, but once we've built the policy and collected some data, now we can update our probability map and use application-specific probabilities notion about the world, the specific world we're sampling based on a little bit of data we collect, and then we can update our policy and do that iteratively over time. And so an example of this in the open ocean is we might collect a depth map of the sea floor. For that depth map, that bathymetry, typically one might have to travel, say, 6 kilometers for a little tiny depth map, as the one shown here. If we can reconstruct it with this active learning, we can do it with traveling only maybe 800 meters. And so on the right-hand side, you'll see a little plot showing the progress of this process and how using selective sampling, we much more quickly converge to a pretty good map with just a little bit of work relative to what you might do if you tried to just sample densely and naively, as most systems really do today. So here's an example of a field deployment, a little bit of a reef area in a marine preserve shown on the left, the value map shown on the lower left, and then you'll see the booster botomic path, classical non-adaptive path The robot's trying to basically work like a lawnmower, going up and down, back and forth, but there's a lot of noise induced by the current and the wind and other phenomena, but it's still trying to execute that. On the right, we see the path generated by our method, where not only is it adaptively changing where the data should be selected, but it's also adapting better to changes in the environmental conditions, giving us a much shorter path and getting equally good or better data. And so here's a sort of plot illustrating that. An example of bad data is on the left. So basically, this is data where the robot, in this case, was collecting visual data of the reef, and it's too high up relative to the ocean bottom to get good pictures. And so this plot shows the amount of bad data over time, and you'll see these classical simple methods get quite a lot of bad data, which is a linearly increasing function of time, whereas our method basically has a much lower slope, collects much less bad data because it adapts to the data it's seeing to try to get data only in the good places. In this case, it does maybe on the order of 3 times as well as classical methods. So in the context of multi-robot environment modeling, we have similar ideas, but now we're taking this idea of adaptive sampling and letting a biologist, a scientist who might be remote, select where the robot should go. So this is a different way of playing the game, where the remote scientist can pick waypoints for the robot interactively over time and adapt the robot's behavior. In this case, the robot talks over the internet to a base, which talks to a flying vehicle, which sends snapshots of the environment from the air, and that can then deploy a boat or maybe an underwater vehicle to go out and collect that data. Our first work on this multi-robot environmental modeling was done back in 2012, first published back then, done a little earlier, of course, and that actually works quite beautifully, at least in terms of the kind of mechanisms you can use and the data that you can collect. The robot dives down, collects data underwater as needed. The boat is used to talk to the underwater vehicle using some sort of simple communications. And so basically, the biologist can say, I'm looking for footage of coral reefs, try these specific waypoints as places to go and get the data. And then once it goes down there, maybe you'll be able to find boulder star, coral, or other kinds of things, sponges, as a function of where you go in this coral reef example. So working with scientists like this is very rewarding. They get some data. It's kind of a pretty experience. It seems to work. This particular experiment was the first of its kind back in 2012, combining a plane, a surface boat, an underwater vehicle, an internet link, etc. The problem is keeping a scientist in the loop during the whole experiment is exhausting and time-consuming and demanding. And also the robots don't know intrinsically what the scientists want, so it's a very tedious process. It's the classical process used for things like, say, Mars exploration vehicles. People have to be in the loop a lot in some of those contexts, but it's not ideal. And it's very hard to automate this kind of notion because the robots don't know where to go to collect the data without the scientist telling them. And so the question is, how can the robot decide what it is that should be interesting? Now, despite those caveats, the work was interesting. We got some great press. We got some nice scientific publications. It worked really well. But what we might like to say instead is, can we make a robotic system that can choose by itself where to focus the camera? And so we might like the biologist to be able to think instead is, I'm looking for footage of coral reefs. And the robot might be able to have some notion of what an interesting coral reef should look like, and it should go there. And so the question is, for the biologist, what is her reward function? That is, what are the characteristics of an interesting image that make it a good place to collect data? And what's her decision-making process? How does she choose where to go, how to pick place number 1 versus place number 2? And so one way to approach that is through Bayesian reward learning. And that's, in fact, a technique that we did look at to some extent in the past. And it's also a classical approach. Another way to think of this is to think of a process of exploitation versus search. So maybe we just want to find different stuff over the coral reefs. And so we'd like to get footage of the coral reefs and try to capture the diversity of the environment. And so some of this work I've done with Yogesh Girdhar, who's now at Woods Hole Oceanographic. And with him, we looked at building models that are intrinsically looking at diversity. And so, for example, we might like to have a robot that can collect a set of snapshots. In this case, maybe just 6 snapshots that capture the diversity of the underwater environment. And as time passes, this set of 6 snapshots gets to capture more and more of the diversity. So eventually it captures quite a lot of the different kinds of things that might be seen in the underwater environment. And And in this particular work, we used topic models where each topic represents one of the different kinds of things you might see in the ocean. And that notion of kind and diversity is formulated automatically by the robot. But there's a quirk to this particular piece of data right here. The lower right image is interesting to the system because there's a little tiny piece of wire that's gotten caught in front of the camera. And the one on the lower left is interesting because it's just bare sand. And so the robot's internal notion of what's interesting doesn't have much to do with the task it's trying to solve. It's just, this is a weird thing, I've never seen it before, I'm going to bring that picture home. Not a bad way for things to go, but not a great one either. And that same approach we've also deployed on flying vehicles. So here's an aerial vehicle that flies over some region, and as time passes, its set of 6 photos starts off being all urban scenes, but then it realizes, oh, I've seen a little bit of ocean, and I've seen a little bit of beach, and eventually it'll see a little bit of forest, and so it ends up building a set of exemplars of the world it lives in that captures some of the intrinsic diversity of that world, and it does it quite effectively, quite nicely, but it doesn't really know what we want. So here's an example of that same system running in the open ocean now, and we're seeing it swim underwater in such a way that instead of being driven by which picture is the most interesting, is being driven by which part of each picture is the most interesting, and it's going to go towards regions of the image that are the most interesting. But this notion of interestingness, just like the little quick demo we saw before, includes the notion of fatigue. So things that have been interesting repeatedly are no longer interesting, just as they would be for us. So it's going to start off finding surprising things on the coral reef that it finds very interesting. After it's seen a lot of this coral reef, by the way, it's not a very healthy reef in this case, after it's seen a lot of that reef, it's going to eventually decide that the boring sand that it had been avoiding in the past might actually be more interesting now because it's gotten quite tired of the reef itself. So in each moment, the red dot is the most interesting point at that particular instant, and it uses a Kalman filter-like process to avoid changing its mind too quickly. After some period of time, it gets tired of the reef, and it goes off looking for more interesting things, and in this case, it encounters a diver, and then it'll follow the diver around for a while, because the diver is interesting for a while until it gets tired of that, and eventually it'll decide that it likes to look at the diver's bubbles. And so this process goes on, looking for more and more diversity in the natural world that it lives in. So the problem with this technique, as beautiful as it is that it can provide novelty and it can collect models of diversity, but it doesn't lead to techniques that necessarily collect useful information for a specific task. So for example, at one point that robot found a turtle swimming, and that was great and surprising, and we all love the imagery. But if you're trying to simply count certain types of coral or damselfish or whatever on the reef, then you may not want to be distracted by this notion of novelty. And so the question is, how can we focus more specifically on task objectives that might have been formulated by a human being? And so one thing we might say is, well, we want to look at footage of coral reefs, let's annotate many images, and through that annotation, we'll learn what it is that makes images valuable, and then we'll use those. So that's a very classical machine learning approach, supervised machine learning. It works really, really well, except that typically it needs a lot of annotation. It has a whole bunch of technical shortcomings or challenges, but the biggest is that in environments with a lot of diversity, you need a lot of training data. You not just need many images, you need many images in an environment like coral reefs where you have non-rigid motion and many complicated phenomena. So it's not unusable, but it's probably not the most preferred method. I think what we might like to have are techniques where we can say things more like, I'm looking for footage of coral reefs like the one in this image, and now here are a bunch of images that have coral reefs in them. I'm not going to have to annotate every single image with what it is in that image that made it interesting. I'm just going to show you a set of examples of images that are interesting, and I'd like the robot to infer what the interesting parts of those images were that made them so interesting. The idea of specifying a reward over a set of images could also apply over other domains, for example, acoustic signals or other kinds of data domains. It might be an underwater signal, it might be a kind of tree, it might be a kind of acoustic signature. So now we've got this idea of what we'll call one-shot informed visual similarity search. So the idea is we're going to give a few exemplars to our system of the kinds of images that it would like that we would like to associate with interesting things, and we'll do some structural association of the material in these images so that the system can learn by itself what the things are that made those images interesting. And the full details, of course, are in our papers. But with a little bit of training, we can build a system that can generate a heat map over the world of things that are interesting and things that sort of satisfy other kind of prototypical requirements. For example, they might be things we want to avoid or the things that we want to follow, like the diver. And so the underlying idea is the system itself uses traditional key point methods to group things in a sequence of images that recur. For example, points that are mapped to a diver are associated with one another. At this level, the system doesn't know what divers are, it doesn't know what coral is, but it knows that these things look similar. This is a kind of classical technique we can do now with convolutional neural nets. And so this notion of key point matching and patch extraction, this is classical established technology in our field today, I would say. We can do this beautifully by using CNNs trained with, for example, ImageNet. So we'll take a CNN, a convolutional neural network encoder, pre-trained with ImageNet, and we'll use it to group together chunks of co-occurring, recurring content in our videos. And then from those clusters of recurring content, we can present those to a human. And the human only has to label those as interesting or uninteresting or associated together, which is a much, much higher level task than annotating individual images or even labeling individual images. And so now we've got a coherent, organized set of clusters. We'll call this weakly supervised hierarchical clustering. And then from that, we can take those clusters and use it to generate an optimization function such that the clusters that are interesting are associated together and the clusters that are uninteresting together or that need to be avoided or that have other kinds of meanings have a different metric value in the space. And then we can deploy this on our underlying system so that it can employ this in practice in the real world when swimming. Now, to actually do this, for example, in the swimming domain or in the flying domain or in other domains involves numerous pragmatic challenges to get these robot systems to really work. Here's an example. In the swimming domain, there's no GPS underwater and there's no radio. So simply following waypoints, let alone avoiding obstacles, is non-trivial. In fact, knowing where you're going is non-trivial because you've got to, for example, stay on feature-rich regions in order to be able to use enough computer vision to perform visual navigation in the first place. If you go out into the open sand, then all you've got is pure inertial data, which is not a great way of doing navigation over long term. So part of our system selects good paths, good regions to navigate over simply because they have enough visual structure to make visual odometry work well, in addition to having other tasks to satisfy, like what's useful for this robot to collect. It also learns to follow targets of interest. That's a straight deep learning multi-target tracker. Here's an example of our robot learning to track another robot. It uses the same kind of idea to track human beings who it might want to use for guidance. Here's an example of one robot with the neural network tracker following another underwater. The one in front is actually equipped with a USBL, so it has sort of a higher cost and a higher performance profile, and so we can build platoons of robots that can work together underwater using this same kind of idea to scale up to cover larger amounts of territory. Now, to do this visual training underwater, we need data again. And for that, we use sim-to-real transfer. So we have simulated data that we use to generate lots and lots of swimming experience, although not perfect. And then from that simulated training, we then do transfer learning to move that into the real-world domain. I won't get into the full details of that story, but let's just say that it's a tremendously powerful idea. We can, with a lot of simulated data and a little bit of real-world data, we can build robotic systems that can efficiently navigate in the open ocean. They can do things like avoiding sand, so they stay on feature-rich regions. For example, in the upper left, we're seeing a robot that's heading to a sandy region, and it'll move to the right a little bit to stay over the coral. They can avoid the sea floor by pitching up and not running into things. They can do things like avoiding obstacles in the environment, and they can basically avoid coral heads as well. So they can move around in the environment using purely learned behaviors. And here we'll see that put together, the straight underwater navigation part of the system, not the part yet where we're doing things that people want, but the part where we're just learning how to move about underwater in an intentional way. And this is work by Travis Manderson in particular. So the idea is we want to find trajectories underwater that are visually feature rich and also let us avoid obstacles. So here we're flying quite close to the coral. I'm saying flying, but actually swimming, and we're trying to avoid getting too close to it, but also staying as close as we can, and also staying in interesting areas. So we don't want to go to barren, uninteresting areas where we won't be able to do any kind of measurement because we don't have anything to look at any longer. So this piece of work is executed in Barbados on Folkestone Reef, a marine preserve. This video is a little bit speeded up, as you can see. Here's what the simulated data looks like. So it's structurally very similar to the real data, but obviously not identical. We use Unreal Engine for these simulations, and we then can learn in these simulations and validate our systems and then transfer that to the real system. Either in real time or afterwards. We can also use direct sparse odometry to build a complete three-dimensional map of the environment. And this quality metric we're seeing on the right is just a measure of how visually interesting is the reef as we swim over it. So one of the challenges here is to be able to look use the two cameras of the robot, one that looks far away and one that looks right up ahead, and to bring those into correspondence so that we can match the faraway images for what we expect to see in the future to the immediate images of what we see now. And by combining these two cameras together, we can do better visual guidance because we can predict what we're going to encounter in the faraway image based on what we're seeing right now when we finally get to those images. So this lets us do navigation with our pair of cameras in such a way that we can do better pose estimation so that we can enhance the quality of our data collection. That is, we've learned how to predict what we're going to encounter from a faraway camera when we eventually get there, and then we can use the close-up camera to actually collect the data we really want. Here's an example of the robot following a diver underwater so that it can use this kind of diver following now to learn from the diver where it should obtain additional data. So it needs to detect and track the diver. It needs to take control actions to follow the diver. It also needs to rotate to look at things that are interesting. So its camera points sort of in the direction of its stomach. So by rolling, in this case sideways, it can look at the reef while it also swims over the diver. And every now and then it can look in other directions to check if there's anything interesting that's appeared there. So it's following an expert leader who's the diver, who's teaching it how to make observations based on learned policies. Now, in this image labeling scenario I just described, we can see also the heat map that corresponds to what parts of the images are the most valuable at the same time that we're swimming, and then it's rolling to record the coral of interest. So here's a little clip of the robot, the diver, its image of the diver, and the heat map. So on the lower left corner, we're seeing its notion of where the diver is. Beside that, on the left, we're seeing a heat map of what's interesting and what's not. So it needs to follow the diver, but it's not supposed to collect data on the driver. So the driver's not intrinsically interesting. But you'll see red pixels appearing every now and then. Those are the kinds of coral it wants to make observations of. So it basically follows the diver, who guides it across the parts of the reef that are interesting, and then it basically records data in the places that are really good. Now, it also has the ability to veer off and do its own thing at times. When it sees something really, really interesting, it can make a little detour and leave the diver alone and then potentially come back later or even get the diver's attention. And so you'll see that illustrated here. Here you're seeing, so sometimes it accidentally finds the surface of the water interesting. That it is a very complicated set of waves and structures, so it does confuse it at times. And here's the diver's leading it off somewhere, but it's going to be distracted by some cool coral, and it's going to head off and do a little segue. On the lower right, you'll see its collision avoidance map. So those yellow bars are the directions for panning, panning and tilting, for pitching and rolling that allow it to minimize its risk of collision. And then the heat map on the other side is what it's really trying to look at. And so now it's veered away from the diver, and the diver's following the robot. So it's going to lead the diver now in a direction of something which it finds potentially valuable that it wants to collect. And it'll do a little pirouette dance when it gets there to indicate to the diver that it really wants a special data collection event to take place. And the diver can at that point grab it and manipulate the robot and indicate, communicate to it through its inertial measurement unit, its IMU. So it's done its little pirouette dance, and the diver is now going to come over and manipulate the robot, indicating that it's accepted this event, or he has accepted this event. Now, a little quick segue into terrestrial vehicles. I'll show related kinds of techniques on a terrestrial vehicle in our lab. So here's a ground vehicle, a small model-sized car. It's pretty much got the same instrumentation as a regular self-driving car. It uses a so-called computational graph to combine model-based learning and experiential learning, unsupervised learning, to learn how to drive in a natural outdoor environment. And in this case, it's learning how to associate images with roughness. And again, it's got one camera that looks far away in the distance, and then one that looks up close. And so it's going to drive around, occasionally bash into something, and learn from scratch how to map the faraway camera, the nearby camera, and the subjective experience from the inertial measurement unit to predict how distant images correspond to current images and how current images correspond to roughness. And in this way, it learns how to drive on open terrain, outdoors, in a field or in the forest, in a way that avoids collisions, keeps on navigable terrain, and actually learns a model of what navigability means, in this case, all from scratch, without any human, extensive human learning, labeling of the image pixels. So although it does take some time to collect this experience and collect this data, the amount of time is on the order of an afternoon as opposed to days or weeks or months. And at the end of this process, it learns basically how to predict which trajectories will lead it on into smooth terrain, which trajectories should be avoided because they're on rough terrain, those are the ones in blue, and which trajectories should be avoided because they might lead it into a collision. And so this is the kind of behavior we want, where basically the robot learns to drive by itself over acceptable terrain, avoiding obstacles, and potentially collecting data of interest. In this experiment, it has a differential GPU on it, a differential GPS on it, but the GPS is used only for ground truth calibration of the results, not for actual navigation. So in conclusion, I've talked about the problem of modeling environment. I believe environmental models today need extensive, fine-grained data in order to be able to model what's going on in the world. To collect that data at a vast scale, autonomy, and in fact robotic autonomy is really the only way to go, whether it's marine, terrestrial, aerial, whatever. When we know exactly what we want to measure, and we simply need to get that data, we can use things like Gaussian process models to provide efficient data collection, which is more efficient than simple deterministic prescribed methods. At times, though, we don't know exactly what we want to collect, or the things we want to collect are changing or perhaps implicit. And in this case, we need to use machine learning methods to help us figure out what and where we want to make that collection. And so we've seen an example of how to use explicit learning from examples to generate the data collection process we need. Along the way, we saw some cool collision avoidance based on neural network learning with unsupervised data. Like any professor, I should acknowledge the fact that essentially all of the hard work was done by my graduate students and my alumni, and I'm indebted to them all. It's a tremendous group. Some of the work that you saw here was especially carried out by Florian Shkurdy, who's now on faculty at University of Toronto, Yogesh Girdhar, who was on faculty at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Travis Manderson, who's a graduate student at McGill University, and Sandeep Manjana, who's also a graduate student at McGill University. And then a tremendous supporting cast.
Hi, my name is Greg Dudek. I'm a professor at McGill University. Oh, God. Hi, my name is Greg Dudek. I'm a professor at McGill University. I'm going to be using this abbreviated video as a replacement for my originally planned keynote. Oh, God, all right. This is not working well.